My name is Daniel Thibodeau, independent filmmaker. I'm standing on the banks of the west branch of the Penobscot River, a place the locals call Dead Man's Curve. Most people have no idea Moores and Spaulding are buried here. In fact, some people think it were people who had an accident on the road behind me. What they don't realize is that this accident happened in 1867. Throughout the years, people have taken it upon themselves to memorialize these brave river drivers. Recently, the Millinocket Knights of Columbus, Council 680, has taken it upon themselves and plan on putting a stone that has these names. For, as you can see, most people have no idea the names of these two river drivers, let alone the story behind their drowning. The story has meaning beyond memorializing the death of two brave river drivers who lost their lives on the river one day. It recounts a tale of courage and fortitude rarely seen today. Unlike most graves along the Penobscot River, the story of the drowning of Moores and Spaulding can be found in the book The Penobscot Man, written by Fanny Ekstrom. It was the custom in those days to hang a river driver's boots in the tree where he lay to rest. 2017 marks the 150th anniversary of the drowning of Moores and Spaulding. Before we get into the details of that story, I need to set the scene first with some background information.
Come on, you river drivers, if I tell you wish to hear the lights of strength and daring, all the northward has no peer. 'Twas the summer of 1860 when we took our revar's team, and in the grand bully band that raggeds up to Loch Cotton Stream. So it's hey derry ho and hey derry down, and draw us down, we'll come to town. Make ready evenings for frolic and song, with woodsmen and whiskey that can't go wrong.
Maine becomes a state in 1820 along with Missouri, just about the time the timber industry really blossomed, and timber had to be worked largely by hand, so men came from cities far and near to make their fortune. And the jumping off point for these men was Nicketow, as it was called long before it was called Medway. Nicketow, which means where the river splits, was where the east branch met the west branch of the Penobscot River. Towards the north, the east branch disappears into the green forest. The west branch brings sparkling water down from the foot of Katahdin, where snow appears on the peak from late October to early July. Around this time, Nicketow saw two men buy land with the intentions of settling here. The area of Nicketow had been settled in three sections. East side of river, including Salmon Stream and Grindstone Road. West side of river, including Powersville, Patagumpus, and the area of land between the east and west branch of the Penobscot River. West side of the Penobscot River saw its first settler when in 1833, Isaac Stevens, who bought lot number 7, land in Western Division, built a sawmill and shingle mill on the lower west side on Nicketow Island. Parts of the old Stevens Dam can still be seen along the shore when the water is low. The east side saw Walter Fisk and family come to Nicketow in 1843. He purchased land, and along with his son Benjamin N. Fisk's home, Nicketow evolved into a little village. Benjamin eventually petitioned the legislature in 1855 to have Nicketow Plantation organized. He was one of the first selectmen when Medway becomes a town in 1875, 5 years after Henry Poor and Son started a large tannery, which resulted in a huge influx of people to that region of Maine, and served as treasurer for the first 10 years of the town's existence. On July 5, 1845, Israel Held sold 250 acres to George Waite, who in turn sold it to his son William. This piece of land was known at the time as the Farm at Nicketow. Henry David Thoreau's book, The Maine Woods, mentions the magnificent view from this farm. Today, this property is known as the Adeline Wiley Place, owned by Charles A. Powers of East Millinocket. Around the same time, Benjamin Crocker bought some property in the Salmon Stream area and built a log house. It was at Crocker's log house that Thoreau stopped on his way to Katahdin. After leaving Crocker's house, Thoreau's next stop was Marn Howard's, James' wife, who lived where Lawrence McLaughlin once lived. Nicketow Plantation was organized in 1855. Charles Powers and Benjamin N. Fisk were the only two assessors to sign the petition. Until 1856, the only way across the Penobscot was by fording or by crossing on the ice in winter. But in 1856, Edward Beetham was granted the right to operate a ferry in Chester. It was a real boom to the settlers of Nicketow, especially in the spring when the runoff made fording dangerous or impossible. Rates were single horse and driver, 5 cents, double team and driver, 25 cents, 4-horse team and driver, 60 cents. Maps from 1859 show the only roads along the Penobscot were tote roads used by settlers and river drivers alike. In 1851, Isaac J. Stevens, first Justice of the Peace from 1849 through 56, and group petitioned the county commissioners for a road from Gooding Arlands, Chester, to Nicketow, Stevens Mill, approved but wasn't completed. In 1852, Benjamin N. Fisk and others petitioned the county commissioners to build a road from Ace Smith, Mattawamkeag, to Nicketow Hotel. In 1859, Ebenezer Clark and others petitioned and managed to get a road from Francis Scammons Woodville, northerly by Johnny Hardy Patagumpus, to the Nicketow Mill on the West Branch. Local records from 1860 show the results from the presidential election was Abraham Lincoln 22, John C. Breckinridge 8, John Bell 1, and Stephen A. Douglas no votes. And note, in 1860, total votes cast for Nicketow Plantation was 31. Nicketow sent her share of men to the Civil War. In 1861, the 11th Maine Infantry Volunteers, Ellsworth Garnett, 21 years old, Jotham Garnett, 23, Nathaniel Davis, 28, George Roll, 42, 14th Maine Infantry, William Waite, 37. Nelson A. Powers, Clark Lakeman, and William Powers missing in action, and others who fought were Gowan Fowles, Bile Fowles, Moses DeBeck, and John Hughes, killed in action, and Joseph Twitchell, who entered the war as a captain and discharged as a lieutenant colonel. And note, in the 1864 election results for Nicketow Plantation, George B. McClellan beat Lincoln by 2 votes. On August 26, 1858, Thomas Fowler, Jr. and his second wife, Olive Hale, bought part of Lot 4, an area north of Rockavima Brook, from Andrew and Mary Powers, and built another home. Previously, Thomas had lived near the mouth of Millinocket Stream with his first wife, Aurora McCausland, when along with his father-in-law, George McCausland, was hired by Thoreau to guide him through to Katahdin. He later moved from Powersville to the area just north of the West Side Ferry Road. Between 1864 and 1865, Bella and Savia opened up a blacksmith shop on the east side, north shore, of the river, lot number 11, which seemed to complete the village of Nicketow.
So it's hey dairy ho and hey dairy dum, and a job is done, we'll come to town. Make ready evenings for frolicking song, with woodsmen and whiskey you can't go wrong. Bo Gadigan was the foreman, he's the pride of Bangor town. There's no other like the Chauncey for to mow the great pines down. Bill Murphy was the smoker with Canada shot Dupree. We the best kept cook in the wilderness, I know, for it was me.
In the early 1800s, lumbering was usually a family affair, with the sawmill operator doing his own logging. As the timber industry grew, supplying to the sawmills became a separate activity. Although Medway wouldn't become an organized town until 1875, it did prove to be an ideal location for men who were looking to provide the mills with much-needed timber, for it was here that the East Branch and West Branch of the Penobscot River come together. In the 1800s, canoes and bateaux traveled the waterways of northern Maine. The Maine woods had been opened up by the time the Great Northern Paper Company began to cut pulpwood, but this was in terms of the needs of the lumbering industry. In 1899, horse-drawn and ox-drawn vehicles were the only means of overland transportation on the highways. From Bangor, the center of northern Maine activity, there were in 1899 public roads up the Penobscot Valley connecting with Greenville. On the Kennebec, roads followed the river to the Forks and on through Jackman to the Quebec border. These were almost universally dirt roads, nearly impassable at times. Taking off from these highways were the tote roads, intended primarily for winter travel into the woods, but also used in summer by teams of oxen and later horses drawing tote wagons. Woodcutting has a long tradition in which the lumbermen exhibited pride in their craft, their physical strength, and guarded their individualism. Their camps were a bastion of the traditional workplace as they defied modern rationalized management and built a culture around masculinity. Woodcutting work was seasonal, and often they lived a migratory life, following harvesting jobs as they opened. Exclusively men working in lumber camps, living in bunkhouses, hard-working, hard-drinking, living a dangerous and independent lifestyle, earned them praise for their skill in doing their work, for being competitive, and for being aggressive. When not at work, they played rough games, told tall tales, and won reputations for consuming large amounts of food. Woodsmen were a healthy sort, but epidemics of disease sometimes hit the lumber camps. Men who died or were killed in the woods or drowned on the drives were often buried on the spot. A woodsman was supposed to know how to take care of himself, which included his own personal safety. Alcohol was not frowned upon in those days, and accidents were frequent and often fatal, with more occurring in the spring during the drive.
We left from Millinocket on such a Wednesday day. We got our axes chipping fog to clear ourselves away. Till at last we reached the bottom of Mount Cotton Big Supreme, and we found that we, within the week, we cleared Katahdin Stream. So it's hey daddy ho, daddy hi, daddy down. When our drive is done, we'll come to town. Make ready mates for frolicking song. With Woodsmen and whiskey, you can't go wrong.
From its source to Medway, the Penobscot River is about 130 miles long and drops 1,174 feet. The greater part of this drop, 678 feet in about 70 miles, occurs between Chesuncook Lake and Medway. Penobscot is a word from the Eastern Algonquin language, a dialect of Abenaki, meaning land of the descending rock. The Penobscot River, following its windings from source to mouth, is about 300 miles long. Its basin, 1/4 of the area of the state of Maine, is 160 miles long and 115 miles wide. The most important subordinate basin is that of the West Branch, which flows from west to east, meeting the East Branch at Medway. All along the cald of the West Branch lie the big lakes and ponds, and on both sides a complex of smaller ponds, lakes, and brooks and streams. 12 miles below Medway, the Mattawamkeag River flows in from the east at the town of the same name. Here the Penobscot turns south, and at Howland, 30 miles further down, the Piscataquis enters from the west. These waters together form the Maine River. First encounters to be documented of this river in Maine was by Frenchman Jean Alphonse sailing up the Norumbega in 1597, which is what the Penobscot River was called then. There at Panawaxis, the original name for Indian Island, Jean Alphonse had this first encounter with the Penobscot Native Americans, whose language we still use today in the names of many of the places in Maine. The great power on the Penobscot is on the West Branch, which has been Great Northern Country since the turn of the century. The area of the West Branch Basin covers approximately 2,012 square miles. Over the years, literally hundreds of driving dams were built on ponds and falls and ledges of dozens of streams in the West Branch watershed. Many were long gone by the time the Great Northern Paper Company came into being. Others, many rebuilt more than once, are today an important part of the company's water storage system.
Oh, Chauncey chopped and Murphy swamped and Canada Jacques did swear. Oh, Galligan go to the oxen on and shouted and tore his hair. Till the wildwood ran with timber as the forest monarchs fell, and the air was split with the echoes of our axe blows and our yell.
In November of 1847, the boat, the Governor Neptune, the first of 8 wood-burning stern-wheelers, steamed up the Penobscot River from Old Town. Named in honor of John Neptune, Native American governor of the Penobscot Nation, she was 100 feet long with a beam of 22 feet and a depth of only 3.5 feet. She and her sister ships plied the river for 22 years, running regularly to Wynn, and when the water was high, all the way to Nicotow. These boats were owned originally by William and Daniel Moore, Jr. of Waterville, who also built 2 steam scows, one named the Nicotow. As early as 1833, there was also some sort of loose organization for driving logs on the Penobscot. The Penobscot Log Driving Company was formed that year, but apparently wasn't too successful, and another company of the same name took over in 1846. This was the famous PLD, Penobscot Log Driving Company, a mutual organization handling the drivers of all the lumbermen landing logs on the West Branch from Chesuncook Dam to Medway, and the delivery of these logs to the booms in Old Town. Everyone owning timberland on the West Branch was eligible for membership. Jams would form on some obstructions in the river, and logs piled up upon a tangle from bank to bank. Breaking a jam required judgment, skill, and courage, often requiring logs to be pried or chopped out. Sometimes putting extra water was all that was required. Other times, dynamite would be used. Little splash dams pool up water which would be let out to flush logs downstream were built often for just one drive. Once the logs were put into the stream, they were soon to be strung out over several miles and immediately begin to lodge on shore, rocks, ledges, and stream beds. The crew was spread out along the drive as conditions required. There would always be some men at the head to keep it moving. The majority of the crew would pick up the rear, pushing, pulling, or rolling stranded logs into the channel. Some of the prominent lumbermen had farms which grew produce and hay for use at their camps. In addition, there were isolated hostelries on the waterways, visited by the men going hunting in the woods, patronized by the woodsmen in the winter and spring, and by the sportsmen fishing or taking canoe trips in the summer. There were paths along the banks of the streams, but boats provided much of the transportation of men and supplies. The bateau became the favored craft among river drivers. Short oars, setting poles, and paddles were used for propulsion and could negotiate rough water. In early operations, logs were hauled to water by the most direct route. During the winter, logs would be piled on frozen lakes and ponds to be delivered to the sawmills by way of the river. In the Maine woods, you could hold one of three occupational titles. Number one, lumberman, anyone who worked in the woods. After the Civil War, it pertained mostly to the businessmen of enterprise. Number two, woodsmen, woodcutters, cooks, sawyers, twitchers, and swampers. And thirdly, river drivers, the same individuals who worked in the woods would continue on the drive. Companies would register a log mark in the same way cattlemen registered a brand. The end of the logs were marked with the company brand, sluiced into the rivers, and when they reached Medway, logs were sorted into booms which fed the sawmills all along the Penobscot into Bangor. Every log cut has a log mark, a design cut with an axe to distinguish it from other lumbermen when put in the drive. Even before operations on the West Branch started in 1828, regulation and cooperative effort had become essential. The great mass of wood being put into the water by so many lumbermen, destined for scores of mills, was resulting in utter confusion. The worst snarls were on the lower river just above the mills, and in 1825, a group of 18 lumbermen formed the Penobscot Boom Corporation to build and operate a sorting boom and to charge for sorting and rafting the logs to the proper mills. The first sorting boom was at Argyle. At the boom, men separated the logs of the different owners, distinguished by slash marks, and made them up into rafts which were floated to the mills if the logs already were sold or were tied up to await a buyer. The last long log drive was in 1928. The first 4-foot pulpwood came to the boom in the drive of 1917, and technically the Penobscot Boom Corporation continued to handle pulpwood until 1953. 3 years later, the PBC and related firms were dissolved, but the Penobscot Log Driving Company lived on. By 1832, the cut of logs was nearly 40 million feet, and a few voices began questioning how long the pine would last. When the largest cut of the century was made, 245 million feet in 1872, more than two-thirds of it was spruce. In 1833, the company Penobscot Boom Corporation was sold to General Samuel Vesey, General of Militia in the War of 1812, a trader, shipbuilder, shipowner, lumberman, banker, and reportedly owner of 52 sawmills between Old Town and Bangor. The water power that made Bangor the lumber capital of the world is located in the last 20 miles above tidewater. Between Old Town and Bangor, the river drops 90 feet, and it was here that there was the greatest concentration of sawmills. Definitely an autocrat, the general apparently pretty much ran the boom to suit himself. This did not suit the lumbermen, who in 1838 got an act through the legislature appointing a commission to manage the boom, after which things went more smoothly for a while. In spite of the three-man commission, things didn't go as well at the sorting boom as the lumbermen wished. Encouraged by the Penobscot Log Driving Company's success, they formed in 1854 the Penobscot Lumbering Association and forced the boom company to rent its property to the new group. Although a steamboat was put into use for towing logs to Moosehead Lake by 1836, the PLD continued to bring logs down from the head of Chesuncook by brute strength and ignorance until 1890, when it built a towboat named the John Ross, a clumsy side-wheel scow replaced in 1902 by the A.B. Smith, also a side-wheeler, which remained in service until 1927.
For 6 whole days and 23 hours we thrashed the forest clean. The logs we skidded by hundreds, such a drive was never seen. We were clear on the mountain and rejoiced in jovial strain. And what did we see but the forest of trees was growing in again. So it's hey, daddy, ho, daddy, hi, daddy, down. When the drive is done, we'll come to town. Make ready, mix a frolicking song with woodsmen and whiskey, you can't go wrong.
The organization of the early woods camp crew consisted of the boss, choppers, swampers, they cut the roads, barkers and loaders, teamsters in charge of the stables. Later came cooks, cookies, cooks' handyman, saw filers, feeders for the animals, and blacksmiths. To the woodcutters, it was his job to bring large amounts of trees to the hungry sawmills all along the many rivers on the East Coast. Lumbermen ventured into the woods with axe in hand, and by the 1850s, Maine became the lumbering capital of the world, with mills crowding every river and stream from the Piscataquis River to the St. Croix. The axe was the only tool used to fell the trees and cut them into logs. By late 1800s, trees were being felled with crosscut saws, but the axe continued to be used for undercutting and limbing.
Then all of a sudden the mountain heaved and a thunder spoke from the earth. Who's walking around in me beard, he cried, and it rumbled in through the mirth. Then next we knew our hand appeared, as large as Moosehead Lake. And it plucked us daintily one by one, while we did they with shake. So it's hey, daddy, ho, daddy, hi, daddy, down. When our drive is done, we'll come to town. Make ready, mix for frolicking song with woodsmen and whiskey, you can't go wrong. Paul Bunyan held us in one hand, but the other he rubbed his chin. Well, I'll be swamped if there's a log me beard right down to me chin. We thought you were Malcolm Totten, Garrigan shouted into his ear. Well, sorry it wouldn't have happened had the weather been more clear. Well, good old Paul didn't mind it all. He paid us for the shave, $100 apiece to the men, and the oxen for he gave.
Most known from Maine legends is the lumberman Paul Bunyan, who was by trade a woodcutter. Paul got his start on the west branch of the Penobscot, and he requested to have his body brought back to Maine to be buried on the west branch when he died. Now, let's set the record straight. Lumberjack was a derogatory term reserved for the city boys who stopped at L.L. Bean in Freeport and showed up at GMP offices with brand new clothes and an axe, eager to work, but naive to the danger and conditions. You wouldn't want to call Paul Bunyan a lumberjack to his face.
Now young private drivers, fill your glasses, fill mine too, and we'll trip to the head of Bo Dedican and his gallant lumbering crew. So it's hey, daddy, ho, daddy, hi, daddy, down. When our drive is done, we'll come to town. Make arrangements for frolicking song with woodsmen and whiskey, you can't go wrong. So it's hey, daddy, ho, daddy, hi, daddy, down. When our drive is done, we'll come to town. To God, Millinocket, we got arrangements for frolicking song with woodsmen and whiskey, you can't go wrong.
And now the details behind the rescue at Rhines Pitch. It was the spring of 1867. Rhines Pitch is 6 miles up the river. Medway is 10 miles down the river. Not too far from the site was Tom Fowler Jr. and Aurora McCausland's farm, before Tom married Olive Hale and moved to Medway. And now,
at the outlet of Quakish Lake begins a great series of falls, later developed into the water power for Great Northern's mills in Millinocket and East Millinocket, beginning with Rhines Pitch, followed by Grand Pitch, ending with Grand Falls, emptying into Shad Pond, stretching for about 5 miles. Not far from Quakish, right where the Millinocket mill was located, was a farm which had been settled by Thomas Fowler Sr., who in 1829 had brought his wife, 5 children, and all the material for a new life in 2 ox carts from Pittsfield to a location just above Shad Pond on the banks of Millinocket Stream. Sometime within the next 10 years, he apparently cut a road through from Millinocket Stream to Quakish Lake, put up new buildings on it, and had gone into the business of moving material around the falls for the lumbermen. Fanny Ekstrom writes in her story,
"The graves along the River Penobscot are many, but the names and most of the lifetime's worth of stories have been lost. Who these river drivers were and what distinguished them from one another remains a mystery. Were they honest, hard-working, and religious men who did not know how to read and write? Or were they the sort of men who drank more than they should and used profanity too much? Their history and names seem to have vanished along with the men who knew them personally and worked beside them on the river."
With hell-bent bravado, you broke the jam that busted your skull that spring. No known kin, you signed the payroll X and went by Bill or Joe. Whitewater's thrill was seasonal. When spikes were winter stored, the river roared through dreams. Your flophouse room was bleak. Mice cracked in your teacup, chewed your new cant dog. The day the jam let go, gnarled tons of spruce caught you mid-current, napping. You bellied up downriver, blonde hair aglow in foam, and they bundled you in burlap, mouthing bits of scripture so your luck would lie down with you here. Now loons spin comic hymns above your bones. Boy Scouts shear new growth that chokes you out each year and paint your cross and white stave fence. Men you might have known still mope in nursing homes, arthritic remnants of the rough and tumble, the river's pounding strength of memory locked in their old sinews, their shriveled arms.
The great Maine woods along the Penobscot River is littered with graves holding strong, heroic men who fought cold and black flies, only to be forgotten by history. The year was 1867, and it was the last days of April when Elijah Spencer, along with 7 other men, turned out their logs from the boom on Quakish Lake on a private drive, arriving at Quakish earlier than the main West Branch Drive. The rains of April that year caused the Penobscot to swell rapidly and made the work of driving logs more difficult and dangerous than usual. The story continues that on the first day of May, Elijah Scott, who was in charge of the drive, along with Rollins, Spencer, and 5 other men, got a jam on the gray rock just below Rhines Pitch. Scott then set out to Fowler's farm to get more help because the jam was in the middle of the river and they only had 1 bateau. Scott realized he had no qualified boatman to handle the drive from Rhines Pitch to Shad Pond, so he left instructions with the men to not lift a cant dog till he got back with more experienced boatmen. Scott figured he'd be back the next day. It is believed that Scott continued on to Medway, 12 miles away, but we hear no more about him in the story. The next day, the men grew restless and decided to pick off a big wing just below Rhines Pitch. This could be done without using a boat. There remained 7 men to pick the jam and a single bateau to take care of it. They must have kept working even though short-handed in manpower and boats. The water was rough, and as it rose, the men were aware that the jam could have hauled at any moment. Dressed in red shirts, the river drivers used their peavies to loosen each log, one by one, until they could see the river running underneath them. Details lie with the men who were there to tell, but it is probable the men picked the jam way up until almost sunset on May 2nd, 1867, probably until 6 p.m. So the story goes, 4 of the men were picking the jam when it would have been time to break for dinner, and that was usually done by the crew before sunset, around 7 p.m.
All of the men were standing on the wing jam when it started to haul from the inside. Spencer, Moores, and Spaulding instantly started across the logs for shore, while the other 4, being inexperienced, ran toward a rock in the middle of the river.
Any river driver worth his mettle would have never done that because chances were great that the rest of the jam would swing out towards the middle of the river, carrying away the foolish, daring to make the mistake. Lucky for them, enough logs were hung up on the rocks to allow them a temporary resting place. That's when the other 3 attempted to rescue them.
The 4 men on the jam were probably happy to see Spaulding, Moores, and Spencer approaching in their boat. The boat was close on being able to board the crew from the rocks when the stern pole snapped and swung the boat broadside into the current. Before they could straighten the boat with paddles, she struck a rock, cracked open, and capsized all in an instant.
Now 3 men in a wrecked boat thrashed in the icy Penobscot. 4 men trapped in the middle of the river, which kept rising from the constant rain, were powerless to do anything but wait. They watched in horror. They witnessed 2 of their friends, Spaulding and Moores, drown outright. Spencer must have felt destined for the same fate.
It had all happened so quickly. The 4 men, who only moments before were looking forward to a warm supper and dry clothes, were suddenly atop a pile of logs, wet, cold, and hungry, with darkness fast approaching, having already witnessed a tragedy with no one knowing they were in trouble.
Moore's body was discovered about a month later at Jerry Brook, and 2 crosses were erected to mark the event. Spaulding was found the following September under a log where the old mill pond was in Medway, 16 miles away from where he drowned. This is an example of one of many logging stories where somebody lost his life and no one thinks of him except the family, setting one less place at the dinner table, or the few friends who go on to date their story by the year that person died. Of course, that isn't the end of this story. Fanny continues the story by writing,
Spencer had somehow got his hand wedged in a crack on the boat when it hit the rock and split open on one side. The 4 men on the log jam had witnessed Spencer being thrown and thrashed about, hitting rocks and logs. They probably surmised he must have met the same fate as Moores and Spaulding, but stunned and beaten, with his fingers crushed and held by the boat, Spencer had been dragged 2 miles down to Island Falls. About the time Spencer thought he might be a goner, just above Grand Falls and Grand Pitch, the boat struck something that opened the crack where his fingers were trapped, and he was able to free himself. Spencer described it as if the boat held on to him until it was safe to release him, did so, and saved him from a fate of certain death. Spencer managed to throw his arms over a log floating by, which miraculously spun him around, and he was able to catch his breath and get to shore.
By this time, the darkness was starting to set in, and John Fowler, who just returned from working near Big Smith Brook and was just sitting down for supper with his family. Spencer, with his bloody fingers worn almost to the bone, limped along the path that passed Grand Pitch. There he rode down Shad Pond in a boat left on shore and went 2 miles up Millinocket Stream when the Fowlers were just finishing dinner.
Spencer arrived at the farm when John and Frank's wives were just finishing up the dinner dishes. After hearing the situation and knowing it would take John some time to yoke up the oxen and drag his boat to the water, the women fixed up a plate of leftovers for Spencer and had him dry off by the fire. John Fowler, with the help of a few Fowler children, got everything ready for the rescue, providing Spencer with some well-needed rest.
Every driver knows the unwritten code of the river is to attempt a rescue as long as there is any chance remaining any men are still alive, no matter what the risk to one's own safety. The willingness of these men to put themselves into harm's way for a fellow driver is nothing short of heroic. River drivers felt obligated to rescue anyone who was in trouble, whether they knew that person or not. A lot of equipment was needed if this rescue was to be successful. Poles and paddles, an axe, all had to be tied down in the boat. Many factors made this rescue difficult. The water was cold and higher than the normal high water mark. It was also long after sunset, and the boat they used was called a Maynard Witch, usually requiring a crew of 6 men and much too large for 2 men. Also, the oxen would have to drag the sled with the boat hitched on over the rougher roads, a feat hard to do even during the daylight hours. It would take more than a half hour to get the boat down to the water and launched. Back on the jam,
4 men wondered if anyone knew of their dire situation. They probably felt they had seen all chances of a rescue get swept away by the river and did not know Spencer had survived and found help. Hours passed, feeling like days, and the whole time the river kept rising, threatening to haul the jam they were resting on.
the sound of John Fowler's voice shouting to his oxen must have been sweet music to the men trapped in the middle of the Penobscot. When Spencer yelled to see if they were still there, they must have dreamed they were already on shore, excited to have supper, dry clothes, and a warm bed in which to rest, putting this whole day behind them. Ekstrom writes,
Nary a word must have been spoken by the four men as they watched the Fowler kids light a big fire for John and Spencer to see to launch the Maynard. Sparks flew high in the sky as more and more dry wood was thrown on the fire. Though safety was imminent, the sounds of the boat splashing in the water was a reminder to the four men that once again they could face the possibility of death, knowing it was no easy task to maneuver a boat in swift current, let alone in the dark of night. John Fowler lit the torch on the bow of his boat while Spencer stayed on the shore. When John began to drop the boat down from the eddy below Rhines Pitch, one of the men rose and said, "Go to the left of the big rock. Don't try to go inside." He had been studying the current for a few hours and was prepared for just this moment.
John Fowler picked his way in the darkness past the boat-splitting rocks, feeling his way inch by inch, seeing little from the light of the torch. The sound of the iron-shod poles hitting the boat could have been heard over the sound of the rising water, reassuring the four that progress was being made. They did not dare to look, for fear that even John Fowler couldn't land that boat.
Then suddenly the boat was below them as John Fowler turned into the eddy. The four held their breath as the torch suddenly dimmed, thinking even the knowledge the Fowlers had of the river might not be enough to match the swiftness of this current. But John Fowler knocked the ash off the torch and it blazed bright once again and lit the way. Fowler poled from the bow, knowing if his pole snapped, he would surely meet the same fate as Moores and Spaulding. John Fowler moved in closer, swinging the side of the boat against the jam. Little time was lost in getting the men into the boat, with Fowler changing places to put him in the place that required the most skill. Slowly he picked his way back to the safety of the eddy below Rhines Pitch.
Once on shore, the men would have thanked John Fowler, for only a Fowler with the skill and knowledge of the river could have made that rescue. Later that night, the jam did haul, but it was of little consequence to the men. Spencer, being most of all worn out, went straight to bed, while the others prepared the night supper. Once again, the river took other lives, leaving them with theirs. The sun would rise again tomorrow, and they would continue their drive, a little more experienced. Some would consider Spencer a hero. A lesser man would have given up, leaving the men behind to suffer the same fate as Moores and Spaulding. The code of the river demanded that he do whatever it took until they were rescued, or until it was known they had drowned. Although the peak of the lumbering sawmill industry on the Penobscot River had been reached in 1872, it was still very much alive in 1898 when the first formal move was made toward the formation of the Great Northern Paper Company.
Stories like this associated with so many graves in the Maine woods were doomed to be unknown when woodcutting stopped being a way of life, the river drives gave way to trucking, and legends ceased to be passed by word of mouth. While many stories died with the men who knew the river drivers, this one story of Dead Man's Curve lives on, making it an example of their reliance upon each other and their courage and skill in being the first to settle and work here in the great Maine woods.
There you have it, the story of Rhines Pitch Rescue. The local Knights of Columbus, Council 680, plan on memorializing this area by placing a footstone with the names of Moores and Spaulding and the day they met their demise. Thank you for watching.
Just sway and swerve. Let us stay away from Dead Man's Curve. Gravesites there where the loggers lay, and late at night they come out to play. Young spirits whose bodies fell while they were driving logs on the paper trail. always told me don't go down. Daddy always told me don't go down. Oh, kids never listen. Cruising the roads late one night, not another car in sight. Me and the boys up to no good. Daddy said nobody knew we would. Headed for the rice farm. We were driving too fast. We're coming to the corner. Or lift off the gas. Tires lost their grip that night. Metal and glass in a thundering flight. They say we should have met our maker, but the spirits there chose not to take us. Northern Maine in a paper town.